Spotify will add content advisories, as you said. So what that means is you'll be directed to their COVID-19 hub, they call it, whenever you go to a podcast that is going to discuss anything to do with COVID-19. So that hub actually features podcasts such as CoronaCast with Dr. Norman Swan, and also Science Versus, which was a great ABC podcast before it was bought by Gimlet in the United States and is now coming out of New York. And so basically it's a way for people to get trusted information about COVID-19 and stop that misinformation.
What's prompted this?
So basically, there were about 270 scientists who signed a letter. This was earlier in January. So 270 scientists signed a letter saying that they were really troubled by Joe Rogan's podcast, which is called the Joe Rogan Experience. They said that he had provided misinformation about COVID on the podcast. They pointed to a number of different examples of this. And off the back of that, Neil Young, the musician, asked for his music to come off Spotify. He said it was either going to be him or Joe Rogan. Mm-hmm. And Spotify chose Joe Rogan, really, because Neil Young, he was saying that 60% of his music streaming comes from Spotify. So he has 6 million listeners, weekly listeners on Spotify. And so basically it's a huge loss to him. Mm. But Spotify made the choice, and it kind of makes sense because the Joe Rogan Experience is the number one podcast here in Australia. Mm-hmm. It's the number one podcast in America. And this is despite the fact that Spotify has an exclusive deal with the podcast. So they signed a $100 million US deal, which is 142 million Australian, with Joe Rogan for this podcast. So it only sits on the Spotify platform. But it is so popular, each episode gets about 11 million listeners. And so he has a huge amount of influence. And so these scientists were upset about what they call misinformation, and so were musicians such as Neil Young, who asked for his music to come off the platform. Interestingly, although his albums and singles and that sort of thing that are directly linked to him have come off, you can still access some of his music by going to the Eat, Pray, Love soundtrack, for example.
Yeah.
You know, his most famous songs are still available on Spotify via different methods. So, and also the supergroup he's in, of course, their music is still on the site. But Joni Mitchell also asked for her music to come off Spotify, but Big Yellow Taxi is still on there. It hasn't yet come off. So, so that's the situation.
So the content advisory, I suppose, appeasing the scientists who wrote in, not appeasing Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, who have pulled their music. But should Spotify have to act in this way? Should they censor the content?
So interestingly, the chief executive, Daniel Ek, he spoke about this issue, and he was saying that he himself doesn't agree with some of the content on Spotify. He doesn't agree with some of the podcasts. You know, they hold different views to what he holds, but he doesn't believe that Spotify should have to censor content. He said that's not their mojo. That's not part of their modus operandi. So he certainly doesn't think so. But it does have a responsibility not to spread misinformation, which is why that situation now is as it is with the content warnings.